I thought moving planets would be peaceful, until the alien women next door noticed me. He pictured himself in a quiet town where no one knew him, where no one expected anything from him, and where he could finally breathe without looking over his shoulder. When the relocation offer arrived, he barely hesitated. Aurelian 9 was not famous. It was not on the travel brochures or in the news for anything exciting. That was exactly why it appealed to him. The planet promised solitude, routine, and safety, a far cry from the chaos he had left behind. Elias remembered the last few months on Earth vividly. He had worked long hours in an office where deadlines and targets seemed endless. People smiled at him, yes, but he knew most of them were too busy with their own lives to notice if he was smiling back. Weekends felt like brief pauses in a constant storm. Even when he was at home, he couldn't escape the pressure. Phones rang too often, emails piled up in the inbox, and the city outside never seemed to rest. Sleep had become a scarce luxury. He had convinced himself that the solution wasn't therapy or hobbies, but distance. He needed space. He needed silence. The journey to Aurelian 9 had been long but uneventful, which suited him perfectly. Unlike Earth's crowded airports and loud spaceports, Aurelian 9 landing station was small and almost empty. Only a few other humans had made the move recently, and the majority of the population were native Aurelians. They were tall, graceful, and quiet, moving with a calm precision that seemed to echo the planet itself. Elias noticed them as he passed through the terminal, but they didn't stare. They didn't rush. They simply existed, and their presence made him feel strangely light, as if the tension he had carried for years was slowly being absorbed by the gentle atmosphere around him. The housing unit he rented was modest, with clean lines and simple furniture. It looked almost identical to the photos he had seen online, but in person it felt even quieter. The walls were a soft cream color, and the windows offered a view of the planet's gently rolling hills. Outside, the sky had a pale lavender tint, different from Earth's blue but not unpleasant. Every morning, sunlight poured through the windows in warm, forgiving rays that seemed to insist he relax. For the first time in years, Elias could sit on the small balcony, drink his morning tea, and watch the world move without feeling like he had to move with it. He unpacked slowly, deliberately. Every item he brought, clothes, books, personal gadgets, was placed in a way that allowed him to see and reach it easily. There was a small bookshelf near the window where he stacked novels and notebooks. A soft chair faced the balcony, where he could sit for hours observing the gentle sway of the Aurelian trees. For Elias, these small acts of arranging his new space felt like reclaiming control over his life. On Earth, life had always felt chaotic, like someone else was deciding when he could rest or work or eat. Here, everything was his choice. The first few days passed quietly. Elias explored the immediate neighborhood on foot. The streets were clean, lined with trees that glimmered faintly under the planet's unusual light. He noticed small shops, cafes, and community areas where both humans and Aurelians interacted politely, without hurry or tension. There were no honking vehicles, no flashing advertisements, and no crowded sidewalks. Everything moved at a deliberate, measured pace, as if the entire planet had agreed to slow down just enough for its residents to breathe. Elias tried to blend in, keeping his head down and avoiding unnecessary interaction. He thought that would be easier. He had been invisible on Earth in his own way, and he assumed that being quiet and polite here would let him disappear into the background again. At first, it worked. He spent his mornings walking the streets and his afternoons reading on the balcony. He watched Aurelian children play, listened to distant conversations in a language he didn't fully understand, and felt the strange satisfaction of simply existing without expectation. It was peaceful, so peaceful that he almost forgot why he had moved in the first place. But peace, as Elias soon discovered, has a way of noticing you. On the third morning, while he sat drinking tea, he realized someone was watching him. It was subtle at first, a shadow across the balcony, a movement behind a window across the street, but enough to make him glance up. There in the apartment next door were 3 Aurelian women. They didn't hide, but they didn't wave either. They simply looked. Their gaze was steady, direct, and somehow different from the casual glances of humans. Elias felt a twinge of discomfort. He wasn't used to being seen. On Earth, it had been easy to move through life without anyone really looking at him. Here he realized that would not be possible. He shook his head, convinced it was just his imagination. Maybe they were neighbors simply curious about the new human. Maybe their culture involved polite observation. He reminded himself that he had chosen a quiet life and he tried to ignore it. But over the next few days, he noticed them more often. They were always there at some point during the morning, sometimes tending plants, sometimes sitting near their windows. Their attention was quiet but unmistakable. Every time Elias looked up, he felt their eyes on him, and it was both unsettling and strangely compelling. Despite his initial discomfort, Elias found himself adjusting. He began leaving small signs of his presence deliberately: a book on the balcony, a cup of tea, a window slightly open with music faintly playing. He didn't know why, but part of him wanted them to notice, even if he wouldn't admit it. For years, he had hidden in plain sight, convinced that solitude was the only way to survive. Now, he felt the first flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: curiosity about others and maybe even connection. By the end of his first week, Elias had settled into a rhythm. He rose with the planet's soft sunlight, walked the streets, returned home, and spent hours reading or reflecting on the balcony. Yet, the presence of his neighbors lingered in his mind. It was subtle, never intrusive, but persistent. He realized he was thinking about them more than he wanted to admit. He was wondering why they were watching him, what they might be thinking, and if it was strange for him to care. It was a feeling he had not expected, and it made him question the very reason he had moved. Peace, he now understood, was never just about silence. One evening, as he sat writing in his notebook, he heard a soft sound outside his door. A note had been slid under it. He picked it up cautiously, half expecting it to be a mistake. The note was simple, written in clear, flowing handwriting. But another part of him, the part that had grown restless even in the calm of Aurelian 9, felt a flicker of anticipation. For the first time since leaving Earth, he felt the possibility of real interaction, not work emails, not superficial greetings, but genuine contact. It was terrifying, it was exciting, and it was entirely unfamiliar. That night, Elias lay awake thinking about what it would mean to accept the invitation. He realized that the planet had not promised him a world without people. It had promised him a world where he could choose his attention, where he could exist on his own terms. And now, he had a choice: remain unseen or allow himself to be noticed. For the first time in years, Elias realized that peace was not the absence of people. It was the freedom to decide how to be with them. Elias stared at the note for a long time, unsure what to do. The idea of stepping outside and facing the 3 Aurelian women made his chest tighten in a way he hadn't felt in years. On Earth, he had avoided any attention, blending into the crowd so that no one looked too closely at him. Here, though, the planet seemed to be insisting he acknowledge something he had long ignored. Other people were not obstacles, they were part of life. After several minutes of hesitation, curiosity won. He rose slowly from his chair, holding the note in one hand as if it were a fragile bridge to an unfamiliar world. His heart beat faster with each step toward the door, and for the first time in months, he noticed the details of his own movements: the weight of his feet, the warmth of his hands, and even the faint sound of his breath in the quiet apartment. Everything felt amplified, as though the silence of Aurelian 9 itself was paying attention to him. When he opened the door, the corridor outside was empty. The faint lavender light of the planet's evening sky filtered through the translucent walls, casting soft shadows across the floor. He felt exposed and small, like a human figure walking through a painting. A few steps forward, and he reached the front of the building. There, on the small communal lawn, were the 3 women. They were standing together, their posture relaxed but purposeful, eyes fixed on him. The air seemed different around them, charged not with threat, but with intent. Elias felt his instincts telling him to turn back, retreat into the safety of solitude. But he remembered the note and took a slow breath. He walked forward, unsure how to greet them. He wanted to be polite but not intrusive, friendly but not bold. The planet seemed to hold its breath as he approached. "Hello," he said softly. The words sounded strange in the quiet air, almost foreign to his own ears. The women responded with nods, their movements fluid, almost synchronized, as if they were aware of each other's thoughts. One of them stepped slightly forward and smiled faintly. Elias noticed how subtle the gesture was. It was not like the smiles on Earth, which were often over-exaggerated or performative. This smile felt deliberate, attentive, and somehow honest. "We saw your note," she said, her voice gentle, yet carrying a strange resonance that made it seem to linger in the air. Elias blinked, startled. Her English was clear but accented with the rhythm of Aurelian's speech. It made every word feel intentional, meaningful. I wasn't sure if I should come," he admitted, scratching the back of his neck. On Earth, this hesitation would have seemed weak, almost pathetic. Here it felt necessary. The women did not look at him with judgment. They only waited, patiently. "You came," another woman said, her tone calm. "That is enough." His entire adult life had been about achieving, performing, surviving. Now he was simply standing in front of three beings who wanted nothing from him, and it felt like both a gift and a test. For several minutes no one spoke. Elias looked around. The communal lawn was quiet except for the gentle rustling of the Aurelian trees. The air smelled faintly sweet, like flowers mixed with ozone. The planet's gravity was lighter than Earth's, and every movement felt deliberate, almost meditative. Elias noticed the subtle glow of the women's skin in the evening light, and he realized that he had never paid attention to another person's presence like this before. Finally, the first woman spoke again. "We notice many things. Some humans move too quickly to see them." "You move differently." Elias felt a strange warmth spreading across his chest. They walked slowly together, introducing themselves. One was called Lyra, another Selena, and the third Orana. They spoke carefully, explaining simple facts about life on Aurelian 9, but always with a hint of curiosity. Elias listened, realizing that he was paying attention more than he had in years. Their questions were not invasive. They were small, thoughtful, meant to understand him as a person. "You are new," Lyra said softly. "You choose quiet, but quiet is not enough to live here. Life needs balance, attention too." Here, balance seemed to mean something different. It meant connection, observation, and awareness. He realized that he had been starving for this kind of presence without even knowing it. As they continued talking, Elias began to notice the small details around him. The way their eyes followed movements without staring. The gentle cadence of their speech. The way they reacted to silence, not with discomfort but with attentiveness. He felt a shift inside him. The walls he had built over years of isolation seemed to wobble, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't want to retreat. Over the next few days, their encounters became routine. Elias would see them from his balcony in the morning, and sometimes they would approach him on the street, asking simple questions about life, weather, or his favorite books. At first, he kept answers short, afraid of giving too much away. But gradually, he found himself talking more freely. He realized that he could share small truths about himself without fear. These interactions were not social obligations. They were invitations to exist in a world that seemed ready to notice him. He also began noticing how the other humans on the planet interacted or didn't interact. Many kept to themselves, moving quietly between apartments, shops, and workstations. But the women did not ignore him. Their presence was consistent, deliberate, and patient. Elias had always assumed that attention was a threat or a burden. Here, he discovered that attention could also be a gift if it was given without expectation. One evening, Lyra invited him to walk along a path near the edge of the community. The path overlooked a valley where the sun reflected off the pale lavender rivers, creating a soft, shimmering glow. Elias had never seen anything like it. The planet's light was different from Earth's, softer and more forgiving, and it made every shadow, every movement seem intentional. "This is our favorite place," Lyra said. "We come here to notice things. Sometimes it is quiet, sometimes it is loud, but it is always alive." On Earth, he had walked many streets and visited many parks, but he had rarely noticed life. He had only observed movement, never presence. Here, the world seemed to insist that he notice, to really see it. And perhaps he realized that was why the women noticed him, because they saw the life in him that he had long ignored. By the end of the week, Elias felt a strange mixture of anticipation and caution. He wanted to see them, to talk to them, to walk with them along quiet paths, but he also felt the old instinct to retreat, to hide, to protect himself. He understood that life here was not the absence of people. It was the choice of how to be with them. That realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. He started to understand that being noticed was not the same as being judged. The women did not demand anything from him. They did not pressure him. They simply paid attention, and in that attention, Elias discovered a reflection of his own humanity, a version of himself he had long neglected. For the first time in years, he felt seen, and that awareness filled him with both curiosity and caution. Elias returned to his apartment that night, exhausted but restless. He sat on the balcony, watching the faint glow of the planet's city lights. The lavender sky seemed to pulse softly, as if the planet itself had noticed his hesitation and was waiting for him to choose. He realized that life on Aurelian 9 was not about running away from attention. It was about learning how to exist in it, to allow connection without losing oneself. And perhaps he thought quietly, That was the most challenging lesson he had ever faced. Elias had never imagined that being noticed could feel so heavy. At first, he had thought it was simply curiosity, a natural response from neighbors encountering a newcomer. But as the days turned into weeks, he began to sense that the women's attention was more than casual. It was deliberate, patient, and in its own way almost investigative. And while he had moved to Aurelian 9 for peace and quiet, he was beginning to realize that being observed, even gently, demanded something of him he had never had to offer before: presence. Every morning, he would wake to find them nearby, often tending plants on their balcony or adjusting the blinds of their windows, just so that he could see the gentle movement of their figures. He tried not to let it disturb him, reminding himself that solitude was his priority. Yet each glance from their attentive eyes made him question whether true peace meant invisibility, or whether he had been hiding from life itself all along. The first conversation that truly unsettled him happened one afternoon while he was walking down the narrow street that ran past the communal gardens. The three women were there, arranging bright flowers in small pots along the edge of the path. Lyra spoke first, her voice soft but steady. "You walk differently from the others," she said. Elias blinked. "Differently. I suppose I just like to take my time." His words sounded bland even to him, but the women did not press. Instead, Orana tilted her head slightly, a small gesture that made him feel examined, not judged. "Noticing is important here," Orana said. "We learn much from those who observe. Even small details tell a story." Details. We notice everything. And the reflection made him uncomfortable in ways he had not expected. Over the next week, Elias began observing himself more closely. He noticed how often he slouched when walking alone, how frequently he avoided eye contact even with strangers, how he fidgeted with his hands when unsure. Small behaviors that he had never considered significant suddenly seemed important. He understood that the women were not simply curious. They were reading him, learning from him, and quietly inviting him to learn from himself. Their attention was not intrusive, but it was persistent. One morning, Elias found himself on his balcony, notebook in hand, when he realized Lyra was standing on the neighboring balcony, watching him write. Instead of feeling annoyed, he felt something unfamiliar: anticipation. For the first time in months, he wanted to share something, not with the world, not with colleagues or friends, but with someone who was truly noticing. He wrote a few sentences, then paused, wondering if it would be worth showing. Later, when the women appeared on the small communal path, he hesitated, then carried his notebook with him. I wrote something," he said, unsure how it would be received. Lyra glanced at the pages, then smiled. "You think we only notice actions, but words are the same." For the first time in years, someone cared enough to read what he created, to observe not just his movements, but his thoughts. Elias realized that he had spent decades hiding in plain sight, but here, he could be seen without the fear of judgment. Yet, the experience was also disquieting. Elias began to recognize that being noticed required responsibility. Every day, the women's presence reminded him that he could not escape his own emotions as easily as he had hoped. If he pretended to be indifferent, they would notice. If he avoided reflection, they would notice. If he withheld feelings, they would notice. For someone used to invisibility, this was a revelation and a challenge. One evening, they invited him to walk along the edge of the forested area behind the community. The trees here were taller, with thin, silvery leaves that shimmered faintly in the planet's soft twilight. The women walked ahead, leaving space for him to follow. Elias felt the weight of their gaze again, not like scrutiny, but like attention that demanded honesty. "Humans often hide from themselves," Lyra said quietly. "Even when they are alone, they do not see clearly. You are different, you notice." The women's attention forced him to face himself, to recognize the parts of him that were neglected, and to understand that peace was not merely the absence of others, it was the presence of awareness. As they walked, Selena asked about his past life on Earth. He answered cautiously at first, giving simple facts about his work, his city, and the reasons for leaving. But the women listened without judgment. Their questions were soft, thoughtful, and aimed at understanding his patterns rather than judging his choices. Slowly, Elias began to share more personal reflections: his exhaustion, his frustration with constant pressure, and his fear that he had wasted years chasing goals that never truly mattered. Orana nodded as he spoke. "We notice those who carry burdens quietly. Many humans carry more than they show." For all his years of studying, analyzing, and surviving on Earth, He had never encountered someone who could read him so clearly without needing a wordy explanation. And yet, he realized that this was what made life on Aurelian 9 different. Connection here was not forced, it was chosen and intentional. And noticing someone, really noticing, required patience, attention, and care. By the end of their walk, Elias felt a mixture of exhaustion and clarity. The forest was quiet, and the air smelled faintly of wildflowers. The women said little as they walked back toward the community, but their presence lingered like a gentle echo. For the first time, Elias felt that the world could exist without chaos, but also that he could not exist without acknowledging the presence of others. He understood that he had spent too long hiding from attention, and now that it had found him, he had to decide how to respond. Over the following days, the interactions became deeper and more personal. The women began to ask him about small habits, the way he organized his apartment, the books he read, even how he made his morning tea. At first, Elias found it strange, almost intrusive, but gradually he saw the wisdom in their observation. Each question, each glance, each note of curiosity was not about controlling him or judging him. It was about understanding him fully and encouraging him to understand himself in return. Elias began to reflect on how he had lived on Earth. He realized that he had often pretended not to care, not to feel, because the world seemed too demanding. Here, though, he discovered that honesty was not dangerous. Being noticed did not require performance, it required presence. And for someone who had long avoided his own thoughts and feelings, this was a revelation. By the end of the week, he began to notice changes in himself. His steps became more deliberate, his attention more focused. He smiled more easily, not for performance, but because he genuinely experienced moments of joy. He started recording observations in his notebook, not just thoughts, but feelings and insights he had previously ignored. He realized that the women's presence had become a mirror reflecting aspects of himself he had not seen. And in that reflection, Elias saw the possibility of growth. The attention that had initially felt unsettling was no longer something to fear. Instead, it was a guide, a quiet insistence that he confront the parts of his life he had neglected and that he embrace the parts of himself he had long forgotten. He began to understand that living on Aurelian 9 was not about escaping life. It was about facing it fully. The women were not intruders. They were teachers in a silent, patient way. And as he began to see this, Elias realized that his initial desire for solitude was not wrong. It was incomplete. Peace, he now understood, required presence as much as absence. Life on Aurelian 9 was no longer simple for Elias Ward. At first, he had believed that he could move to another planet and simply fade into the background, living a life of quiet solitude. But the steady attention of the three women next door had gradually altered the rhythm of his days. He noticed small changes in himself that surprised him, how he lingered longer over his morning tea, how he started reading books he had previously ignored, and even how he walked with more awareness, careful not to hide behind his old habits of rushing and distraction. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. He would catch himself glancing toward their balcony while arranging his workspace, wondering if they were watching him. Each observation felt like a gentle pressure, a reminder that his actions were visible, that his life was no longer fully private. He told himself he did not mind, but deep down, he realized he did. Being seen was both comforting and unnerving. One afternoon, as he returned from a walk through the community gardens, he noticed that more humans seemed to be observing him too. Some paused briefly in their routines, others offered quiet nods. Unlike the Aurelian women, their attention lacked patience and subtlety. It was quick, fleeting, and sometimes even awkward. The contrast startled him. He realized that Aurelian culture encouraged noticing, reflecting, and understanding. Human attention, on the other hand, was often accidental, careless, or meant to judge. Elias began to appreciate the women's quiet presence more than ever. Their attention was deliberate, but it also carried a weight of responsibility, an expectation of honesty, consistency, and openness. The first real test of this came when Lyra approached him one evening at the communal walkway. "You seem distracted," she said softly, as if she had been following his inner thoughts rather than his outward movements. Elias hesitated, unsure how to answer. He had spent so many years avoiding deep reflection, he wasn't sure he even remembered how to express what he felt. I guess I have been thinking a lot," he admitted finally, "about how I lived before, about myself." He spoke of exhaustion, of years of avoiding connection, of the loneliness he had carried even in the presence of others. He spoke of fear, the fear that his life had been too small, too hidden, and too focused on tasks that never mattered. When he finished, the women did not offer advice, nor did they judge. They simply listened, their expressions calm and patient. Lyra finally said, "You notice now what you did not before, but noticing is only the first step. Understanding takes time." True peace required awareness, responsibility, and the courage to be seen, even when it was uncomfortable. The next days were difficult. Elias noticed that he could no longer ignore the way the women observed him. Their presence was constant yet subtle, and it left him with little space to retreat into his old habits of invisibility. He found himself reflecting on every small action, how he arranged his workspace, the order of his daily routines, the way he spoke to others in passing. Every movement seemed to carry weight, as though his life was no longer entirely his own. One morning, while preparing tea on his balcony, he realized that the women had left notes for him again, small observations about his habits, questions about his choices, or gentle suggestions about how to improve his daily routines. At first, he felt the instinct to ignore them, as he would have done with anyone on Earth. But he found himself reading the notes carefully, noticing the thought and attention behind every word. Each message reminded him that he was no longer unseen, and that the life he had long hidden could now be reflected back to him with clarity and care. This reflection was not always easy to bear. Elias began to confront aspects of himself he had long ignored, his fears of failure, his discomfort with intimacy, and the habits that had kept him isolated. The women did not force him to confront these things. They merely observed, asked gentle questions, and allowed him to come to his own realizations. And yet the effect was profound. He discovered that he could no longer escape from himself, because someone else was quietly insisting that he face who he was. One evening, Orana invited him to join them in a small communal garden. The light was soft, filtered through the silvery leaves of the native trees. The three women moved among the plants with practiced care, demonstrating how to cultivate them. Elias followed along, mimicking their movements and observing the patience with which they worked. He realized that even the smallest actions carried meaning, and that the way he engaged with the world reflected his inner state. "You must learn to act with awareness," Orana said, noticing his hesitation. "Not for us, not for anyone, for yourself. Life is too short to move without noticing." He found himself smiling more naturally, speaking with more care, and noticing things he had overlooked for years. The way light fell across a balcony, the pattern of clouds in the lavender sky, the quiet joy of a plant unfurling its leaves. Each observation was a small victory over his old habits of invisibility, and yet he also felt the strain of constant attention. The women's patience was not intrusive, but it left little room for complacency. He could not hide from himself, nor could he hide from their noticing. Then came the day when he realized the full extent of their influence. He had been walking through the community when a young Aurelian child approached him. The child's curiosity reminded him of the way the women had observed him at first, and he felt a wave of self-consciousness. He noticed the way he moved, the rhythm of his speech, and the expressions on his face. He realized that he had internalized the women's careful attention, and that he now observed himself with the same intensity. It was both empowering and exhausting. Elias understood that the presence of others was not merely a gift, it was a responsibility. He could no longer ignore how he lived, thought, or acted. Every choice, no matter how small, carried weight, because he was now part of a network of awareness that stretched beyond himself. The culmination of this awareness came one evening when he received another note from Lyra. It was short, simple, but direct. Or he could embrace the noticing, accept the responsibility, and allow himself to grow in ways he had long avoided. He thought about the weeks he had spent on Aurelian 9, the slow walks, the reflective conversations, the moments of silence filled with observation. He remembered the way the women had mirrored his actions, patiently guiding him toward awareness. And he realized that peace, the kind he had once sought in solitude, could never exist without connection. To be truly at peace, he had to be seen, understood, and engaged. By the end of that night, Elias made a quiet decision. He would not retreat. He would not hide. He would accept the presence of the women, the awareness of the planet, and the reflection of himself that had been awakened. It would be difficult, perhaps exhausting at times, but it was the only way to live fully. The next morning, he stepped onto his balcony with a sense of purpose he had never felt before. The women were there, as always, tending to the plants, observing the world. Elias smiled at them, not awkwardly, not shyly, but with intention. He noticed the light on their faces, the rhythm of their movements, and the quiet energy of the community. For the first time, he felt a balance between solitude and attention, between reflection and connection. He realized that the planet had given him a gift greater than peace, the chance to truly exist, with all the responsibility and awareness that came with being noticed. Elias Ward had never thought he would feel at home anywhere beyond Earth. For years, he had wandered from place to place, moving through life like a shadow, careful not to draw attention, careful not to feel too much. He had imagined that moving to Aurelian 9 would finally allow him to disappear, to live quietly and alone, untouched by expectation or observation. And yet, the very thing he had hoped to avoid, the noticing, the attention, the reflection, had become the most vital part of his life. The mornings on Aurelian 9 now held a quiet ritual. Elias would rise with the soft lavender light spilling into his apartment, stretch carefully, and step onto his balcony to greet the day. Across the narrow gap, the three women, Lyra, Selena, and Orana, were already tending to their plants, adjusting blinds, or simply watching the world move. Their presence no longer unsettled him. Instead, it grounded him. He had grown accustomed to being observed, not as an intrusion, but as a form of companionship, a mirror reflecting his own thoughts and actions back to him. At first, Elias had resisted. Being noticed was uncomfortable, even frightening. He had spent so many years avoiding attention that the simplest glance could make him feel exposed. But over time, he realized that their observation was not a threat, it was an invitation. It invited him to live with honesty, to acknowledge himself, and to embrace his own presence. Peace, he discovered, was not the absence of attention, but the acceptance of it. The first real turning point came during one of their shared walks along the edge of the community gardens. The pale rivers reflected the soft light of the evening, and the air smelled faintly of native flowers. Elias had walked these paths many times before, but this evening felt different. He was aware of his footsteps, his breathing, and the rhythm of his heart. The women walked beside him without speaking, their presence gentle, supportive, and attentive. He felt neither judged nor pressured. He simply felt known. "You move differently now," Lyra said quietly, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, deliberate, and full of meaning. "There is awareness in your steps. You notice the world in ways you did not before." Understanding comes next. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of life on Aurelian 9 became familiar, comforting, and grounding. Elias discovered that he could live fully without abandoning solitude. The quiet moments on his balcony, the soft light of morning, the gentle observation of the women, all of it allowed him to connect with himself more deeply than he ever had. He began to notice patterns in his thoughts, the small habits he had carried for years, and the emotions he had avoided confronting. And for the first time, he accepted them without judgment. Even the small rituals of daily life gained significance. Making morning tea was no longer a task to be completed quickly. It was an opportunity to pause, to observe the steam rising from the cup, the soft glow of sunlight, and the quiet rhythm of his own hands. Reading became more than entertainment. It became a way to explore his inner world, to understand ideas and emotions he had long neglected. And walking through the community, once a mundane task, now offered countless chances to observe life, to notice small gestures, and to reflect on his place in the world. One afternoon, Lyra invited him to join her in tending a small section of the community garden. Elias had watched her do this many times, but he had never participated. He hesitated at first, unsure of his skill or knowledge. But as he worked alongside her, planting, watering, and observing, he felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. Every movement became meaningful. Every small gesture, a careful placement of a seed, the gentle touch of soil, was a reflection of presence and intention. He realized that even the simplest actions could carry significance when performed with awareness. Over time, Elias noticed subtle changes in his own character. He smiled more easily, not because he sought approval, but because he genuinely appreciated small moments of joy. He listened more attentively to the sounds around him, the gentle rustling of leaves, the hum of distant rivers, the soft cadence of Aurelian speech. He began to anticipate the presence of the women not with anxiety, but with calm curiosity, eager to share small observations, insights, and reflections. The most profound change, however, was internal. Elias had spent decades avoiding himself, hiding behind routines, work, and distraction. Here, he could no longer hide. Being noticed had forced him to confront his own thoughts and emotions, to accept his vulnerabilities and to embrace his strengths. He discovered that solitude was valuable, but connection, careful, intentional, respectful connection, was transformative. He no longer sought peace in invisibility. He sought peace in authenticity, in fully inhabiting his own life. One evening, as the lavender sky deepened into soft shades of violet, Elias sat with the women near the edge of a small pond. The water reflected the sky, creating a mirror of light and shadow. Lyra spoke first. "You have changed," she said. "Not because we noticed you, but because you allowed yourself to be seen." I never thought being noticed could be good," he admitted. "On Earth, attention always felt like pressure. Here, it feels like understanding." The women's attention had taught him the subtle art of awareness, the balance between solitude and engagement, reflection and action. He could no longer live as he had before, distracted, hidden, and hurried. Now he could exist fully with intention and in harmony with others. As the days passed, Elias continued to integrate this understanding into every aspect of his life. He developed routines that combined quiet reflection with active engagement. Mornings were for observation and self-reflection, afternoons for learning, reading, and conversation, evenings for walks, tending gardens, and silent appreciation of the world. Each day became a meditation in presence, a practice in noticing, and a lesson in authenticity. He also began to form connections beyond the women next door. Other humans and Aurelians in the community noticed the change in him, the deliberate attention, the calm presence, the thoughtful responses. People began seeking his company, asking for advice, or simply enjoying his calm presence. Elias did not crave attention, but he welcomed it with gratitude, knowing that being noticed did not diminish him. It enriched him. One afternoon, while walking along the lavender-lit streets, he paused to watch a small group of children playing near the pond. He observed the way they interacted, the careful attention they paid to each other, the quiet joy in their movements, the natural curiosity that guided their actions. He realized that he was no longer just a participant in life, but a witness, an observer, and a guide in subtle ways. The world no longer felt chaotic or overwhelming. It felt alive, meaningful, and full of connection. The final realization came one quiet morning as he sipped his tea on the balcony. The women were nearby, their movements calm, deliberate, and unhurried. For the first time, Elias understood that peace was not something given. It was something chosen, cultivated, and practiced. It was not the absence of people or distraction, but the presence of awareness, understanding, and connection. The planet had given him solitude, but the women had given him reflection. And in that balance, he found something he had never known before, the ability to exist fully without fear, without hiding, and without the constant need to escape. He smiled, feeling the lavender light warm his face. For years, he had thought moving planets would mean hiding from life. But now, he understood the truth. Life was not something to escape. Life was something to engage with, notice, and participate in fully. The women next door had taught him that peace was not hiding. It was seeing, being seen, and living honestly in every small moment. Elias leaned back, letting the sunlight touch his face, and for the first time he felt complete. He had arrived not in a place free from attention, but in a life full of awareness, reflection, and connection. And that, he realized, was the kind of peace he had been searching for all along.